Whenever you throw a running back into your fantasy football lineup, you're just hoping for at least 10 fantasy points. Well, last week in week 8, we had 28 running backs score at least 10 fantasy points. So who could do it this week? Let's dive into our week 9 running back rankings. Now, like always, before we dive into the rankings, let me cover a few of my bigger hits and misses from just last week at the running back position. Now, when we take a look at the hits, we got DeAndre Swift, Rashad White, Josh Jacobs. All of them played up to expectations. We had them ranked correctly. A few of the bigger misses, though. Ramondre Stevenson had himself a huge week 8. We did not have him ranked high enough. And then Breece Hall and Saquon Barkley. Obviously, every single week, they're going to be ranked pretty highly. They did not perform. They were a total bust in week 8. But we got a lot of great options in week 9, so let's go ahead and dive into the rankings and bring up Tier 1. Now in Tier 1, we have Saquon Barkley, Derrick Henry, Kyren Williams, Bijan Robinson, Jahmyr Gibbs, Joe Mixon, James Cook, and Alvin Kamara. Starting off with Saquon Barkley here at the top, though he's going up against the Jacksonville Jaguars. Barkley is the current running back 3 overall in fantasy football, and he's coming off a game in where Jalen Hurts pushed all the TDs away from Saquon Barkley. Now, Barkley has had at least 11 fantasy points in all but one game this year, and now a matchup going up against Jacksonville. They allow over 23 fantasy points per game, 6th most in the NFL to opposing running backs. Then we got the King, Derrick Henry, going up against Denver. And the King continues to reign supreme as the overall running back 1 right now in fantasy football. He has almost 30 fantasy points more than the current running back 2, which is Alvin Kamara. He hasn't had less than 14 fantasy points in a game since week 1. And now adding Deontay Johnson to this offense is only going to help open up the running game even more. We already know that Denver is easier to run on than throw on, so the King's up here at number 2. At 3, it's Kyren Williams going up against Seattle. It's death, taxes, and a weekly Kyren Williams tutty. He's got touchdowns now in 10 straight regular season games, hasn't scored under 15 fantasy points in a game since week 2, and having Cooper Kupp and Puka Nacua back is only going to help open up highways for him to run through in this Los Angeles offense. Now a matchup going up against Seattle, they allow the 7th most fantasy points per game to opposing running backs. Then we got Bijan Robinson going up against Dallas. And Bijan haters have been having a rough couple of weeks here as of late, because Bijan has had at least 20 fantasy points now in 3 straight games. He's had over 100 total yards and at least a touchdown in 3 straight games. And now he's going up against Dallas, which is an absolute dumpster fire, and they allow the 2nd most fantasy points per game to opposing running backs. Then we go down to Jahmyr Gibbs going up against Green Bay. 2 huge weeks, and now all of a sudden, Jahmyr Gibbs is up to running back 5 on the season. He's had 19 plus fantasy points in 3 of his last 4 games played. He's averaging 15 touches a game, has touchdowns in all but 2 games this season, and has 130 plus total yards in 2 straight. Now a matchup going up against Green Bay, they are definitely easier to run on. Plus, if Jordan Love does not play in this game and Detroit gets up early, we may see even more involvement in the running game, so Jahmyr Gibbs is number 5. Now after Gibbs, we got Joe Mixon going up against the Jets, and Mixon has played 5 games in Houston so far this year, and he has scored 21 plus fantasy points in all of them. He's had 120 plus yards in 4 of the 5 games he's played. And now with Nico Collins still out and Stephon Diggs out, you have to think he's going to be relied upon even more in this offense. The Jets, they're easier to run on than throw on, and they do allow 18 fantasy points per game to opposing running backs, so Mixon's at number 6. Then we have James Cook going up against Miami. Does anyone remember what this dude did against Miami the last time they played back in week 2? The dude only had 12 touches, but he turned it into 95 total yards and 3 touchdowns. Buffalo just has the number of the Miami Dolphins. Now, despite missing a game this season, James Cook is still the running back 7 overall, and Miami allows the 9th most fantasy points per game to opposing running backs. After James Cook, let's round out Tier 1 with Alvin Kamara going up against Carolina. The current running back 2 overall, coming off a bounce back last week against the Los Angeles Chargers. Had his first 100-yard game since week 4, but touchdowns really haven't been there since week 2. Now a matchup going up against Carolina, who allows the most fantasy points per game to opposing running backs. Alvin Kamara up inside Tier 1 at number 8 overall. So now let's dive into Tier 2, where we have Kenneth Walker, Jonathan Taylor, Devon Achane, DeAndre Swift, Breece Hall, Aaron Jones, Kareem Hunt, and David Montgomery. For Kenneth Walker, he's going up against the Los Angeles Rams, and just had an overall bad game for Seattle in Week 8. No one did great in that offense. It happens. Walker is still the running back 11 overall on the season and averaging 17 fantasy points per game, and the passing work that he's getting is great. His career high is 29 receptions. He already has 27 on the year this year, and now has a matchup going up against the Rams, who allow over 21 fantasy points per game to opposing running backs. After him, we got Jonathan Taylor going up against Minnesota, and the switch back to Joe Flacco is only going to help out Jonathan Taylor. Flacco, we know, can throw the ball down the field successfully, which is going to pull defenders outside of the box. Now, Minnesota, they're not very easy to run on, but they have now allowed over 100 yards rushing in back-to-back ball games. Then we go down to Devon Achane going up against Buffalo. Tua returns, and so does the Achane production as expected last week. In their last game against Buffalo, Devon Achane had 165 total yards and a touchdown. Now last week, he just had a season high in targets with 8 as well. In a matchup going up against Buffalo, they allow the third most fantasy points per game to opposing running backs. Devon Achane up inside the top 12 at number 11. Then we have DeAndre Swift going against Arizona. And it's crazy to look back and see that this guy couldn't get more than 42 yards in a game the first 3 weeks of the season. Since then, he has 4 straight games with at least 119 total yards and a touchdown, getting 18 plus touches in 4 straight games, and now a matchup going up against Arizona, who allows the 5th most fantasy points per game to the running back position. Then we go down to Breece Hall going up against Houston. Hard for Breece to ever find consistency when the Jets hardly ever have a lead to play with. What's really crazy is he's averaging almost the same numbers as last year, 5.2 yards per touch, 4 receptions a game, 13 carries a game. He's just not scoring touchdowns in a matchup now going up against Houston, who allows the 4th fewest fantasy points per game. I had to drop Breece Hall outside the top 12, number 13. Then we go down to Aaron Jones going up against Indianapolis, and he remains a super solid mid to high-end RB2 weekly. He's averaging 14 fantasy points per game, has had 95 plus yards in 5 of the 7 games he's played this season, but the loss of offensive tackle Christian Darrisaw is going to hurt. We're going to need more passing work going the way of Aaron Jones, and this is a good matchup. Indianapolis, they allow 21 fantasy points per game to opposing running backs, so Aaron Jones is at 14 overall. Then we go down to Kareem Hunt going up against Tampa Bay. And we know that Isaiah Pacheco could be coming back soon, but Kareem Hunt has earned a role in this offense rest of season, no doubt. He's had 22 plus touches in 3 straight games, 4 touchdowns over his last 3 games, and now he gets a Tampa Bay defense that is completely banged up and allows over 22 fantasy points per game to opposing running backs. For right now, Kareem Hunt at 15. Then we go down to David Montgomery at 16 going up against Green Bay. And it's crazy to see that over Monty's last 4 games, he hasn't had over 13 touches in any of those games. Detroit has been included in some blowouts here as of late, and honestly, they haven't really overworked Monty. He's still a great weekly flex and a guy with high touchdown upside every single week, and we know that Green Bay is easier to run on. So now let's move on from Tier 2 and go down to Tier 3, where we have Josh Jacobs, Brian Robinson, James Conner, J.K. Dobbins, Ramondre Stevenson, Tony Pollard, and Chase Brown. For Josh Jacobs, he's going up against Detroit, and he's had back-to-back big games. He's all the way up to running back 9 on the season. In fact, back-to-back games, over 17 fantasy points in each of them, has 4 touchdowns over his last 4 games, and we know that Jordan Love is dealing with a groin injury. Seems to be getting better, but not for sure whether or not he's going to play this week. But this is no easy matchup. Detroit allows the 3rd fewest fantasy points per game to opposing running backs, however, has allowed 100 plus yards now in 3 of their last 4 games played, so Josh Jacobs is at 17. 18 is Brian Robinson of the Washington Commanders going up against the Giants. And since the minor injury he had back in week 5, his ceiling has just been a little bit lower. But the Washington Commanders have been getting big leads in 2 of their last 3 games and just haven't really overused Brian Robinson. Now, this past week, he had 17 touches, which is a great sign, and now going up against the Giants, who allow 20 fantasy points per game, got Brian Robinson at number 18. Then we got James Conner going against Chicago. Volume alone is enough to make him a top 20 running back weekly. He's had 19 plus touches in 6 of his 8 games this season. His efficiency numbers are down a little bit here as of late, but with Arizona being competitive, James Conner is the cornerstone of this offense. He's still the running back 12 overall, averaging 13 fantasy points per game, and Chicago is middle of the pack against the run, so I got him at number 19. Then we go down to J.K. Dobbins at number 20, going up against Cleveland. He's just racking up the touches. He's had 17 plus touches in every game since week 2. Only one game since week 2 with over 100 total yards though, so he really needs to find the end zone to not hurt your fantasy team. He's the current running back 18 overall, averaging 13 fantasy points per game, but a difficult matchup going up against Cleveland, who does allow the 6th fewest fantasy points per game to opposing running backs. Then we go down to Ramondre Stevenson going up against Tennessee, and he finally returned to fantasy relevance in week 8. Only had 65 total yards, but found the end zone twice and had a 2-point conversion. Now, Drake May is in concussion protocol, and Tennessee is easier to run on than throw on, so Ramondre Stevenson season at number 21. 22 is Tony Pollard going up against those New England Patriots, and he may be one of the most frustrating running backs to figure out in fantasy football. He does nothing against the likes of Green Bay or Buffalo when he's supposed to perform, then has over 115 total yards against Detroit last week. Pollard, the current running back 22, averaging 12 fantasy points per game, and New England allows the 4th most fantasy points per game to opposing running backs. Got Tony Pollard at 22 in tier 3, and then lastly, to round out tier 3, we got Chase Brown of the Cincinnati Bengals going up against the Las Vegas Raiders. Now, the ceiling has been a little bit lower here as of late, but he does have 10 plus fantasy points in 4 of his last 5 games played. Touchdowns in 4 of his last 5 games played, but now Zach Moss is back in the mix, kinda. This will be, however, the best matchup that Chase Brown has had in multiple weeks going up against Las Vegas. They allow over 22 fantasy points per game, 10th most in the NFL. Which will bring us down to tier 4. It's Chuba Hubbard, Tank Bigsby, Tyrone Tracy, Rachaad White, Alexander Mattison, and Raheem Mostert. Now for Hubbard, he's got a matchup going up against New Orleans, but now we know that Bryce Young is going to be starting again, which means this offense is going to have a hard time putting the ball in the end zone. Now, New Orleans does allow the 8th most fantasy points per game to opposing running backs, and that's the only reason he finds himself inside the top 24 at number 24, because also, does Jonathan Brooks make his debut this week? That's something we're paying close attention to as well. After him, we got Tank Bigsby going up against Philadelphia, and it sounds like Travis Etienne could be coming back this week. But we know that this passing game right now is completely decimated in Jacksonville. We know that Christian Kirk is done for the year. Brian Thomas Jr. is banged up. Gabe Davis is banged up. Somebody's going to have to move the ball for the Jacksonville Jaguars, but this is not an easy matchup. Philadelphia allows the 5th fewest fantasy points per game to opposing running backs, and if the Eagles can get an early lead, Jacksonville isn't going to be able to run very much. Then we got Tyrone Tracy going up against the Washington Commanders. Now, he is currently in the concussion protocol, so we do not know whether or not he's going to play yet for sure, and that's why he's a little bit lower right now. But it is clear that he is so much better than Devin Singletary. He's had at least 13 fantasy points in 3 of his last 4 games played. Now going up against Washington, they've allowed over 20 fantasy points per game to opposing running backs. If he plays in this matchup, it's a good matchup for Tyrone Tracy. If he doesn't, Devin Singletary is probably going to make the top 36, somewhere right around RB 30 or so. Now, after Tyrone Tracy, we got Rachaad White of the Tampa Bay Buccaneers going up against Kansas City. And all it took for Rachaad White to be fantasy relevant again was an injury to Mike Evans and Chris Godwin. He's had back-to-back games now of over 13 fantasy points, 3 touchdowns over the last 2 weeks, but the running game is going to struggle this week going up against Kansas City. Rachaad White is going to need that passing work, and that is actually where he excels and why he's still at 27. 28 is Alexander Mattison going up against Cincinnati, and we've talked about his volume for weeks. We knew last week was going to suck going up against Kansas City, but he still touched the ball 19 times. Now he gets a matchup going up against Cincinnati, and they allow almost 19 fantasy points per game to running backs, so Madison's up here at 28. And then lastly, to round out tier 4, is Raheem Mostert going up against Buffalo. His efficiency has been bad here this season. Now, luckily, last week he saved it by finding the end zone twice with 2 touchdowns, and that's where he's going to make his fantasy money. Miami is going to need to run the ball successfully if they want to have any chance at beating Buffalo this week. Raheem Mostert needs those touchdowns. He's a flex option, but a risky flex option. Which then just leaves us tier 5, where we have Nick Chubb, Bucky Irving, Travis Etienne, Javonte Williams, Tyler Algier, Zach Charbonnet, Austin Eckler. Now for Nick Chubb, he's got a matchup going up against the Chargers, and we can tell he's starting to be ramped up slowly in this offense. It's only a matter of time before he has one of those old school Nick Chubb type games. But he had a difficult matchup last week going up against Baltimore, and it's not much easier this week going against the Chargers, who allow the 2nd fewest fantasy points per game to opposing running backs. The only team that allows less is the Kansas City Chiefs. However, like we say for so many other players, having a quarterback that can push the ball down the field helps helps open up a run game, and that's something that Jameis Winston can do. Then we got Bucky Irving going up against Kansas City, and he's kind of solidified himself as a weekly flex play. He's had 10 plus fantasy points in 3 straight games, and even with the minor injury he's needed in this offense so badly due to so many injuries, he's still getting weekly touches. This matchup absolutely sucks though, going up against Kansas City, the top run defense in the NFL. Still some flex appeal maybe in deeper PPR leagues. Now, after Bucky, we got Travis Etienne going up against Philadelphia, and he could return this week, but how many snaps does he play? Because this is not a great matchup, and if he's splitting snaps in a possible negative game script, there is nothing safe about Travis Etienne this week. Now, after him, we got Javonte Williams going up against Baltimore, and man, he absolutely sucked us in, then gave us the old school D-Generation X suck it in the game last week against Carolina, where he only had 52 total yards and no touchdowns, averaged only 2.5 yards per touch against Carolina. I mean, WTF. Now he gets a matchup going up against Baltimore, who allows the 7th fewest fantasy points per game to running backs, had to drop him down to 33. Then we have Tyler Algier going up against Dallas. And we know that going into every single week, the guy's going to touch the ball right around 10 times a game. And really, if we're considering him in fantasy football, it's got to be a great matchup. Well, the matchup going up against Dallas is pretty great because they do allow the 2nd most fantasy points per game to opposing running backs. Then we got Zach Charbonnet going up against the Rams. And if DK Metcalf does miss this game, Seattle is going to have to use Zach Charbonnet a little bit more just to try to keep pace with the Los Angeles Rams. Still more of a deeper league flex play at best. And then lastly, it's Austin Eckler going up against the Giants. He played well against them back in week 2. Really has more of a 10-point ceiling at best, but there are worse options out there. So there you have the quick and dirty top 36 running backs for week 9 fantasy football. Now, I don't know about you, but I'm hoping for another week where we have almost 30 running backs score at least 10 fantasy points. Now, if you want your running backs to score at least 10 fantasy points, you got to hit the like button if you haven't already. And if you're new here, consider subscribing. Even though the fantasy season is more than half over, find yourself a home here with Headliner Nation. Now, I'm going to go ahead and get out for the day, but hopefully you enjoy the rest of your day, and then most importantly, do your part to make the world a better place.
Analytics off the chain, other channels not the same. Jake and Kyle, you know the name. Headliner Nation, we running the game.